ladies and gentlemen, I screwed up. I screwed up. I went too deep. I thought I was going to be a journalist. I went down the rabbit hole, and what I discovered will bore you to tears. Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to another episode of the Ranger Gareth podcast, where I speak about all kinds of nature news, environmental topics, and today's topic is going to be a doozy. So get comfy, get yourself a nice cup of cocoa, sit down and relax. For any of the young ears that listen to this podcast, parents, just be aware I might get a little heated over a document that should not get me heated. So every year, Natural Resources Canada, which is part of our federal government, they release a document called the State of Canada's Forests. This document is rarely without criticism as the feds try to balance industry needs versus conservation needs. So we're going to dive deep into the official report from the federal government, as well as I guess you could call it the rebuttal from a bunch of the nature organizations and conservation groups. So for the remaining nerds that want to learn more about the state of Canada's forest, we're going to dive right into it. The document I'm referencing is the State of Canada's Forests Annual Report 2024. 2024 was also the 125th anniversary of the Canadian Forest Service. So if this podcast somehow gets shared with any foresters, thanks for the work you do. The official document from the feds, we're going to dive into that one first. It is split into a few broad categories, each presented as a question. How much forest does Canada have? How are Canada's forests harvested sustainably? How does disturbance shape Canada's forests? How do forests benefit Canadians? How does the forest sector contribute to Canada's economy? And how is the forest sector changing? So the initial document is 155 pages, and the response piece from the environmental charities would be 74 pages. I know it's been almost a year since the last episode. I'm trying to get back into it now. So for those that don't know me, my name is Gareth, former park ranger, current conservationist. My dream is to one day make enough money from this podcast that it becomes my full-time job. So this last year has been super busy. I will fill you in on all the details in future episodes, but let's just say I have not been wasting any time. So, you ready? You comfy? You good? Yeah? Okay? Sure? All right, we'll start with the Government of Canada's official report. It begins with a message from the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Tim Hodgson. He writes about how Canada is a leader in forest sustainability, how the forestry sector contributed billions to the economy and supported hundreds of thousands of jobs, and how technology is improving our wildlife monitoring capabilities, such as improved satellite imagery. Any listeners from Canada and the United States would know how bad the wildfire smoke can get, especially last year. We are lucky that we had a rainy summer for 2025. The opening message also heavily emphasizes the themes of partnership with Indigenous communities, which the federal government has made a central pillar of their platform. The State of Canada's Forests Annual Report has been published for 34 years, and this year's theme is the evolution of forestry in Canada and the 125 years of the Canadian Forest Service. This report also focuses on sustainability indicators, which are tools for understanding the overall health of Canadian forests. In 2015, Canada adopted the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This includes goals such as reversing forest loss, improving the benefits and livelihoods derived from forest, and using sustainable forest products. So we jump into the fun part, well, fun for me, the statistics part of the report. I'm a big fan of numbers, it helps visualize things. Canada has around 368 million hectares of forested area, so for any American listeners, that's about 909 million acres. This is greater than the total area of India. Around 50,000 hectares were deforested for a range of reasons, including agriculture, mining, and hydroelectric projects. Our forest is almost 68% coniferous, 16% mixed wood, and 10% deciduous, referred to as broadleaf in this report. 13 million hectares were disturbed by insects, including trees killed by beetles. 17 million hectares were burned by wildfires. 413,000 hectares were replanted, and 10,000 hectares were seeded. Around 9.1% of our forests are considered protected under the IUCN standards, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. These stats are then broken down by province to see how each province's forest was disturbed and what was the domestic economic impact, how many residents are employed by the forestry sector. Quebec had the greatest number of forestry employees overall, which that tracks. That tracks. They do have the second largest population in all of Canada, a lot of land mass, a lot of forest. On a good note, mountain pine beetle numbers are collapsing due to aggressive control measures and some very cold snaps over the winter. On a bad note, in 2024, communities in southern Northwest Territories and northwestern Quebec endured hazardous smoke concentration levels for over half of the summer. I believe it was over 18 parts per million. I forgot to write that number down. This document had a very interesting graph showing the percentage of estimated age classes of forests in Canada. So the majority of our forests are between 60 to 120 years old. It's thought that around 4% would be over 200 years old. That makes sense just with the amount of forests that are harvested or burned or die natural deaths. So yeah, 60 to 120 years. The majority of old growth is like along coastal areas or on islands, places where they can be safe from fire. How are Canada's forests harvested sustainably? Over 90% of Canada's forests are publicly owned, being managed by provincial or territorial governments. The laws applied to these forests are meant to align with sustainable forest management practices. So after harvest, the forest is left either to naturally regenerate or the area is replanted. Climate change is shifting the ranges of tree species, so Canada might soon be able to harvest trees that typically grow south of the border. Take that as you will. Maybe that's doomsday, maybe that's new opportunity. The amount of forest area harvested has historically been between 600,000 to 800,000 hectares per year. Forest area harvested is one of the biggest indicators of economic activity associated with the Canadian forestry sector. So in a typical year, 300 to 500,000 hectares of land are officially replanted. Canada generally harvests less than the estimated sustainable harvest level, which provides us with a healthy buffer zone. The demand for Canadian wood pulp, and wood fiber remains strong. And how does disturbance shape Canada's forests? Even though mountain pine beetle numbers are dropping, they've also expanded their range into Alberta. A variety of forest insects have been having a negative impact on forests, including spongy moths in Ontario, eastern spruce budworm, jack pine budworm, and spruce beetle. Several forest diseases are also affecting our trees, including oak wilt disease, sooty bark disease in maples, aspen running canker disease, and a brand spanking new canker disease of laurel willow in Alberta. A canker is a sunken, discolored part of the bark that weakens the tree and often oozes sap. It's often caused by fungus or bacteria entering an open wound in a tree. So if you see a tree that is, discolored and oozing, it might be a canker. 2024 had several large wildfires, mainly started by lightning strikes, but exacerbated by a poor snowpack and a hot, dry summer. The entire population of Canada was exposed to poor air quality at some point in the summer due to high levels of particulate matter in the air. I know at one point, I believe it was last year or the year before, unfortunately, wildfires are so common now it's hard for me to know which year it was, but the smoke was so bad in Edmonton that it had that kind of orange tint. If anyone has seen Blade Runner 2049, when they're in that desert scene and everything's kind of an orange haze, that is what Edmonton looked like. Not good. Not good for the lungs either. You spend your whole life not smoking and then one summer ruins all of that. Thanks a lot. Forest carbon emissions were high due to the amount of carbon released during wildfires. How do forests benefit Canadians? They act as a natural cleanser by removing pollutants from air and water. They're good for our mental health as well as our physical health. This is reflected in recreational pursuits as well as the increased attention to the topic of forest bathing. Oh, goodness. I know they just opened up another forest bathing trail somewhere in Edmonton. Let me just take a slight detour to find out where that is now. And I feel like they were also offering forest bathing programs in was it White Mud Ravine? Yeah, White Mud. Forests also have strong cultural significance for all Canadians, Indigenous, Métis, any of us. We're all connected to the forests. Many Canadians are employed in the forest industry with average earnings of 56,400 Canadian. Roughly 1/3 of Canadians reside in or near forested areas, with 300 communities, which represent 2% of the Canadian population, relying on forests as vital sources of income and employment. The forest sector contributed $27 billion in GDP and $36 billion of exports. 200,000 people were employed, 11,000 were Indigenous. It generated $2.3 billion in taxes and revenue for provincial and territorial governments. 76% of our exports went to the United States, 10% to China, 3% to Japan. Forest sector financial performance has been weak, with a lower return on investment in 2024 compared to previous years. Forest sector greenhouse gas emissions have been slowly declining every year, mainly thanks to improvements in technology and efficiency. Now, the next segment of the report highlighted forestry research centers across Canada, and then it spotlighted individual Canadian Forest Service personnel. Then the document ended with 31 pages of references, so it was extremely thorough. Now we're going to get on to the rebuttal of the document. So the rebuttal was created by the David Suzuki Foundation, Nature Canada, Nature Quebec, Natural Resources Defence Council, Ontario Nature, Sierra Club BC, Sierra Club Canada, and the Wilderness Committee. My first thought was that the document was very visually appealing. It appears designed for easy digestion, but then when I started reading through it, it was also still fairly dense. The executive summary goes hard, though. They are not pulling any punches. So there's something called the Montreal Process. Canada and several other countries had signed on to the Montreal Process Working Group. The thing is, the document by the feds only mentioned a few of the Montreal Process indicators. There are multiple references to forestry activity having a negative impact on wildlife, especially the endangered caribou. The critique also questions how wildfire activity combined with industrial activity is harming the forest. And finally, they mention how the state of Canada's forest document doesn't do enough to address challenges facing Indigenous-led conservation within a managed forest, as well as land rights disputes. This report provides 7 recommendations to align Canada better with the Montreal Process. These are conservation of biological diversity, productive capacity of forest ecosystems, forest ecosystem health and vitality, conservation of soil and water resources, forest contribution to global carbon cycles, socioeconomic benefits, and a framework for forest conservation and sustainable management. It's clear that both the government and the conservation groups love the forest, but maybe for different reasons. This critique takes issue with the term sustainability, arguing it is not well defined and measurable. Forest management policies are often heavily influenced by the forest industry that they are meant to regulate, leading to often favorable regulations. As one of the members of the Montreal Process Working Group, Canada is part of a coalition representing 90% of the world's temperate and boreal forests and half of global roundwood production. So according to the rebuttal to the state of Canada's forest, the following indicators were poorly addressed. So the cumulative impacts or changes to the industrial footprint, annual harvest of non-wood forest products. I guess that would include animals, berries, fish. Socioeconomic impacts of mill closures, loss of old growth, changes in age classes of trees, glyphosate spraying. Nobody likes glyphosate. Forest fragmentation, status of forest dwelling species at risk, mill pollution, subsidies to the forestry sector, impacts of logging of forest floods and medicines, Indigenous protected and conservation areas, progress towards global biodiversity framework commitments, and the role of industry lobbyists in developing legal and policy regime. This report then highlights some overlooked and underrepresented stories about forest degradation and Indigenous rights. So the first criteria of the Montreal Process was conservation of biological diversity. I'm going to quote this document directly. Conserving biodiversity is essential for maintaining the functionality, productivity, and resilience of forest ecosystems. Under natural conditions, forests evolve through successional stages and typically within expected boundaries of variation. Changes in tree species and age classes generally occur in somewhat predictable patterns that sustain a wide range of habitats for forest-dependent species over time. Industrial resource extraction activities negatively impact biodiversity by altering and fragmenting habitats, introducing invasive species, and reducing species populations and ranges. For example, many studies have shown that decades of industrial logging have changed forest composition and or lead to landscapes dominated by younger forests. Industrial development activities also introduce networks of roads for which there are no ecological parallels. These changes have been shown to weaken forest resilience and diminish structure and function. There's a big focus on reduction of old-growth forests in BC. Something called the Old Growth Technical Advisory Panel identified 2.6 million hectares of old-growth forest for protection. This is 5% of total forested area in BC and just over half of the at-risk old-growth areas. This means the other half don't really have any formal protections. Each province was assigned a letter grade for how the government fared at protecting nature. Alberta got an F, probably doesn't surprise a lot of people. Somehow Quebec got an A-, which confused me because this same report also shreds their failure at protecting environmental or endangered caribou. So I'm really not sure how Quebec is getting an A- here. Overall, they gave the federal government I believe it was a B+ for protecting forests at a national scale, and an A- for the federal marine area protection. Moving on to criteria 2 of the Montreal Process Working Group, the maintenance of productive capacity of forest ecosystems. So according to the Montreal Process's second criterion, sustainable forest management requires understanding how much can be extracted from forests without compromising ecosystem functions. A decline in the forest productive capacity can signal poor management. Key indicators include the area of available forest for wood production, growing stock, annual volume of wood harvested, and annual harvest of non-wood plants. Production of food plants, animals, pollinators, etc. It highlights the herbicide spraying in forested areas, including the much criticized glyphosate. The way I understood it from the document is that when there's an official tree replanting campaign, glyphosate is sprayed in order to keep other plants from growing in that area and outcompeting the trees. So yeah, I don't know, it seems a little overkill, like bringing a warhammer to hammer in a nail. Like, you don't need to do all of that. But hey, no, I should quit talking shit. I'm not a forester. I'm just a dude that thinks industrial scale spraying of pesticides and herbicides that stay in your system until the day you die is not a good thing. Criterion 3, maintenance of forest ecosystem health and vitality. So industrial logging processes can negatively impact forest ecosystem health and reduce forest resilience to climate change in several ways. They can make ecosystems more vulnerable to pests, disease, and extreme weather by replacing diversified forests with plantations of 1 to 2 species, decrease soil moisture and water retention, increasing the risk of droughts and flooding, fragment habitat, introduce invasive species, and alter predator-prey dynamics as a result of extensive road networks used to access timber. For anyone that's not sure about that one, apparently wolves have been using logging roads to access areas of habitat they normally would not be able to. And finally, making landscapes more prone to fire by altering the mix of tree species and removing certain species altogether. There are disputes between the conservation groups and the industry groups around whether managed forests are actually more resistant to wildfires or less resistant. Criterion 4, conservation and maintenance of soil and water resources. Again, I'm going to quote directly from the document. Forests play a critical role in regulating and maintaining the health of soil and water resources. As noted in the 4th criterion of the Montreal Process, forest degradation, such as from poor management practices, can significantly alter forest soils, water quality and quantity, and associated aquatic habitats. So industrial logging can result in soil compaction, erosion, loss of riparian buffer zones, increased sediment in streams, and damage to aquatic habitats. It can also disrupt water flow, increasing flood risks, or reducing stream flow. Then it linked to an article about how extensive clear cutting is increasing flooding risk in BC. Anyone from BC or Alberta is well aware of all the headlines about atmospheric rivers causing massive flooding. But part of the problem is that without the forest to absorb the extra water and act like a big sponge upstream, all that water is just going to rip downstream. Criterion 5, maintenance of forest contribution to global carbon cycles. The Montreal Process's fifth criterion evaluates forest contribution to global carbon cycles. It includes indicators related to total forest ecosystems, carbon pools and fluxes, total carbon stored in forest products and their associated fluxes, as well as the avoided fossil fuel carbon emissions by using forest biomass as an energy source. Logging is Canada's third biggest carbon emitter after oil and gas and transport, but above agriculture and electricity generation. This report argues the government shouldn't take credit for carbon naturally captured by trees if it isn't also taking the blame for carbon released by forest fires. Fair point. This report also takes issue with the idea of using forest biomass as a sustainable form of electricity generation. Okay, so I think their concern is that if wood pulp, wood fiber becomes a popular energy source, then we're going to end up cutting way more trees to throw into the furnace to, God, we're going back to like wood-fired, coal-fired power. But I feel like if it's done right, it would actually be a sustainable form of electricity generation. Isn't that literally what sustainable means? You use it and then it grows back, and then you use it and then it grows back, and you keep doing that at a sustainable level so you never run out of your resource. I really thought biomass would have been the silver bullet. Criterion 6, enhancement of long-term multiple socioeconomic benefits. Forests provide a wide range of benefits to diverse stakeholders, and managing them sustainably requires recognizing sociocultural, ecological, and economic needs while ensuring inclusive governance, particularly for Indigenous peoples and local communities who depend on forests for their livelihoods and cultural identity. The sixth criterion of the Montreal Process emphasizes the maintenance and enhancement of long-term socioeconomic benefits to meet the needs of society. It includes indicators related to the production and consumption of forest products, investment and employment in the forest sector, forest-based recreation and tourism, and other social and cultural values associated with forests. Notably, it also has an indicator to measure the extent of forests managed primarily for their cultural, social, and spiritual values to people and communities, including Indigenous communities and others with strong ties to forests. Whew. So, multiple references to the future of IPCAs, or Indigenous Protected and Conservation Areas. This is a newer concept, not brand new, but newer. A lot of people may not be familiar with it, but essentially picture something like a national or provincial park, but entirely owned and managed by local Indigenous communities. That's what they are trying to do. It's a step towards reconciliation, a bit of self-government, bit of self-determination. There's also, no, I shouldn't touch that topic. Often regarded as a key pillar of reconciliation discussions, giving protected areas over to Indigenous groups for management, Ontario has refused to support any of the IPCAs proposed in the province, even while weakening environmental protections. There was a big hubbub about the provincial government of Ontario replacing the Endangered Species Act with a weaker act. Oh God, I should have pulled the name up for this, but let's just give me a break. It's been a while since I recorded. I'm still here. Don't touch that dial. I also just realized don't touch that dial is such a dated reference. So they're replacing it with something called the Species Conservation Act, which would replace the strict criteria for habitat protection with a more discretionary regime. Things would be a lot more decentralized, which would mean local governments would have a lot more ability to alter the agreement and alter the environment in a way that suits them a little better. Oh God, that could, you know what? That should be a whole new episode. Criterion 7, legal, institutional, and economic framework for forest conservation and sustainable management. This criterion focuses on the frameworks that underpin the forest conservation and sustainable management components outlined in Criterion 1 to 6. This includes indicators of the legislation and policies designed to support both the sustainable management of forests and cross-sectoral policy and program coordination. Reporting on these indicators is essential for raising public and political awareness of forest-related issues and fostering greater support for sustainable management. So as the Montreal process notes, public participation and conflict resolution in forest-related decision-making are essential as they can lead to decisions that are widely accepted and result in better forest management. And then the document goes on to talk about how ownership of Canadian forestry companies is becoming increasingly concentrated, leading to a very powerful lobby. This report ends with a list of recommendations addressing each criterion and then has a further 9 pages of references. So, oh my God, I read almost 330 pages of this stuff to bring you the facts, to bring you the hot goss of the nature nerd world. But yeah, for anyone that made it to the end, kudos. Wow. A little surprised I made it to the end myself. That was a lot of reading, a lot of interpretation. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments about the state of Canada's forests. Are we doing good? Is it a doomsday scenario yet? Should we be worried? Should we be really worried, or a little worried, or not worried? I'm naturally always kind of in the little worried category, so I'll end it there. Thanks for listening. Share it with your friends. Subscribe. Talk to you later.